Plans are not decisions, and assure you that we are not about to decide to abandon all we and the Afghan people have achieved over the past 12 years. Based on the results of the Loya Jirga, expressions of public opinion throughout the country, and discussions during my own visit to Kabul last week, I don't believe that there can be any serious doubt that the Afghan people want American and NATO forces to stay and recognize that the bilateral security agreement is a necessary prerequisite. The bilateral security agreement is also the keystone of a much wider international commitment involving over 7 countries ready to provide economic and security assistance to Afghanistan beyond 2015. Afghanistan's regional neighbors, with the exception of Iran, also understand the importance of the BSA. I understand, for instance, that President Putin of Russia, President Xi of China, Prime Minister Singh of India, and Prime Minister Sharif of Pakistan have all personally urged President Karzai to conclude the bilateral security agreement. Several of these leaders are no fans of American military presence in Central Asia, but all of them seem to recognize that without a continued international military and economic support, Afghanistan risks falling back into civil war, with the attendant rise in extremist groups, outflow of refugees, and disruptions in commerce that would threaten the region as a whole. Given this coincidence of Afghan public and regional governmental opinion, I see little chance that the bilateral security agreement will not eventually be concluded. Awaiting the arrival of the next Afghan president to do so, however, will impose large and unnecessary costs on the Afghan people. Already, the anxiety caused by President Karzai's refusal to heed the advice of the Loya Jirga is having that effect. While in Kabul last week, I learned from the World Bank and other sources that the Afghan currency is slipping in value. Inflation is increasing. Capital is fleeing. Property values are dropping. Perhaps for the first time since 2001, the outflow of population exceeds the return of refugees. The longer this uncertainty about the future international commitment to Afghanistan continues, the more anxiety among the population will increase, potentially dominating the upcoming presidential elections, threatening to turn these into a polarizing rather than a unifying experience for the country. Prolonged uncertainty over the bilateral security agreement will also erode larger international support for Afghanistan. In Tokyo and in Chicago in 2012, the international community pledged billions of dollars to support the Afghan security forces and the Afghan economy beyond 2014. As in the United States, fulfillment of these pledges is dependent on public support and parliamentary approval. Prolonged delay in concluding the bilateral security agreement and the also required NATO equivalent agreement can only diminish the prospect that these pledges will be fully met. In sum, Mr. Chairman, I continue to believe that the bilateral security agreement will ultimately be concluded, but I am seriously dismayed at the cost to the Afghan people that delay, that significant further delay will cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're going to go to Mr. Dumont next.
Chairman Royce, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the upcoming year of transition in Afghanistan. Before turning our attention,
Mr. Dumont, just move the mic a little closer.
Before turning our attention to the upcoming year, I would like to quickly review the status of the security transition in Afghanistan. In June of this year, the Afghans reached a decisive milestone, assuming lead responsibility for security countrywide. This milestone also signaled a shift in the International Security Assistance Force's primary mission from combat to training, advising, and assisting the Afghan security forces. The ANSF, a large integrated force, are now successfully providing security for the people of Afghanistan. This past summer fighting season was the first time that both planned and executed with the Afghans wholly in the lead. The NSF proved to be both capable and resilient, conducting nearly all combat operations across Afghanistan while taking the majority of the casualties. They successfully held the security gains of recent years, and the insurgency failed to achieve its stated objective. The fact that the NSF, a force in its infancy just 4 years ago, is increasingly able to maintain the gains made by a coalition of 49 nations is a significant accomplishment. As we look toward the coming year, DOD will focus on the key areas of support for a successful political transition in Afghanistan, continuation of the Train, Advise, and Assist mission to develop the ANSF into a sustainable force, a narrowly focused counterterrorism mission, and the drawdown and realignment of U.S. forces for a post-2014 Train, Advise, and Assist mission. Our Train, Advise, and Assist mission will continue to emphasize developing ANSF capabilities to conduct high-level planning and execution of operations, as well as the capability to sustain and enable those operations. Ministerial-level assistance will continue to be focused on institutionalizing the systems and capabilities necessary to organize, resource, train, and sustain the ANSF. This will include acquisition, contracting, strategy and policy development, human resources, management, and financial and resource management. The ANSF can be a guarantor for a secure and democratic Afghanistan, but not without continued progress toward developing a sustainable and professional force. As we draw down our presence, we will focus on improving accountability and increasing oversight of funding for the ANSF. This is to ensure adequate capacity and measures of accountability are in place as we incrementally increase direct contributions to the Afghan government while their financial management capacity grows. Coalition forces are working with the Afghans to finish implementing automated systems that will increase transparency and accountability in the areas of pay, logistics, human resources, and financial management. They are also focused on developing the technical expertise necessary in the Afghan security ministries to plan, program, budget, and execute financial transactions to sustain the ANSF. Although the combat leadership shift from ISAF to the ANSF demonstrates first and foremost the capability and resolve of the Afghan security forces to secure their people and their nation, it also enables the United States and other coalition partners to reduce their forces. As President Obama announced in the State of the Union address in February 2013, the U.S. will reduce its force level to 34,000 personnel by February 12, 2014. This force level will generally be maintained through the election period to ensure we are able to provide support if requested. The steady pace of force level reductions from now to February 2014 and after the election period will allow our train, advise, and assist effort to consolidate from lower to higher levels of command as the ANSF displays greater capacity. This progression will enable effective assistance as coalition forces draw down and allow for a smooth transition of the ANSF to operate with reduced coalition support. The ANSF will exercise greater autonomy and leadership of security operations while still having access to support from ISAF as required and as available. While this process is underway, NATO remains on track to bring the ISAF mission to a close by the end of 2014 and transition to the new NATO Train, Advise, and Assist mission. The mission for U.S. forces in Afghanistan is also shifting to a continued counterterrorism mission against al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and training, advising, and equipping Afghan forces as part of the NATO mission. As the President has made clear, however, the United States must secure an agreement that protects U.S. troops and must have an invitation from the Afghan government to fulfill the promise of the post-2014 partnership discussed at the 2012 Chicago NATO Summit. We welcome the Loya Jirga's endorsement of the bilateral security agreement, and we are prepared to sign the agreement. Concluding the BSA promptly would be an important signal to the people of Afghanistan, to the Taliban and our allies, and to the world that we intend to continue our partnership in support of Afghanistan. After more than a decade of dedication and sacrifice by our forces, our coalition partners, and the Afghan people, along multiple lines of effort, we've seen remarkable turnaround in Afghanistan. Today, the Afghan people have greater economic opportunity, greater access to health care, education, and more freedoms and individual rights than in the past. Thank you for continuing to your support for the mission in Afghanistan and our servicemen and women. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Sampler.
Chairman Royce, members of the committee, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify before you today. I've been working on and in Afghanistan in both civilian and military roles since 2002. In addition to having worked with the Afghan Emergency Loya Jirga and then the Afghan Constitutional Loya Jirga, I've served as a representative of an international NGO and as Chief of Staff of the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. After the fall of the Taliban, I saw firsthand an Afghanistan that had been devastated by decades of conflict. The unprecedented investment of U.S. taxpayers and the international community in partnership with the Afghans themselves has created transformational changes in Afghanistan that are reflected in the United Nations 2013 Human Development Index. Afghanistan improved its score in that index by more than 60%, more than any other country. Changes of this magnitude are not made overnight, especially in such a deeply traditional society and such a challenging operational environment. The results of international civilian assistance are significant but fragile. For example, in 2002, there were only 900,000 Afghan children in school, and virtually none of them were girls. Today, there are nearly 8 million children in school, and more than 1/3 of them are girls. Life expectancy in Afghanistan has increased from 42 years to over 62 years. Maternal mortality rates have declined by 80%, and child mortality has decreased by almost 50%. In 2002, only 6% of Afghans had access to reliable electricity. Today, that number is 18%. In 2002, there were very few fixed telephone lines, and making a telephone call out of Afghanistan required a satellite telephone. Today, the combined phone networks in Afghanistan cover 90% of the population, and 85% of women in Afghanistan have access to a cell phone. Today, there are over 3,000 women-owned businesses and associations. Almost 20% of Afghans enrolled in higher education are now women, and women are active participants in the Afghan political process. As we enter the transition period, USAID's strategy is threefold. First, to maintain and make durable the gains in health, education, and the empowerment of women. Second, to mitigate the economic impact of the military drawdown. And finally, to foster and improve stability by supporting legitimate and effective Afghan governance, to include the 2014 elections. USAID places a high priority on ensuring that American taxpayer funds are used wisely. While many of the issues in Afghanistan are unique to that country, monitoring projects in challenging environments is something that our agency does well around the world. In designing the Afghanistan monitoring strategy, USAID has incorporated lessons learned from our monitoring programs in places like Colombia, Pakistan, and South Sudan. I will note that these programs, which form the basis of our Afghanistan monitoring program, have been reviewed in 6 separate Inspector General reports, as well as 3 reports by the Government Accountability Office. Finally, external audits provide useful oversight and discipline for our work and complement and reinforce USAID's own efforts to ensure U.S. tax dollars are used effectively and efficiently. There are currently over 100 audits ongoing now of USAID programs in Afghanistan. The bottom line is that USAID will terminate programs if we feel a particular program is not adequately overseen or is not producing development results. With regard to the elections, a credible, transparent, and inclusive electoral process is essential and central to U.S. government's transition strategy and is critical to Afghan stability and democratic development. USAID remains focused on supporting an inclusive and democratic process by supporting Afghan electoral authorities and by building the capacity of democratic stakeholders in Afghanistan to participate in a robust and informed way. USAID supports independent domestic observers, civil society, media, political parties, helping them appropriately engage in the democratic process. USAID is also supporting the participation of women in all aspects of the electoral process. We are promoting the hiring and training of female polling staff, promoting public outreach to women voters by civil society and public officials, and enhancing the ability of women candidates to campaign effectively. In conclusion, I've worked in Afghanistan as a member of the Department of Defense, USAID, and the Department of State. I've attended ramp ceremonies for the fallen heroes of all 3 organizations. I am personally, and USAID is institutionally, keenly aware of the enormous sacrifices made by Americans to build a secure and stable Afghanistan. And we fully understand the need for constant vigilance, particularly during this delicate transition period. We're making tough decisions, we're prioritizing our investments, and we're looking for things that have the greatest potential for long-term success. As USAID navigates through the 2014 transition period, we continue to be committed to safeguarding taxpayer funds and ensuring that the remarkable development progress made in Afghanistan is maintained and made durable. It's an honor to be able to share with you today a small glimpse of what USAID is doing in that regard. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sampler. Thank you for your good work, gentlemen, on all of these fronts. But as you're pointing out, Mr. Sampler, about the steps that are being taken concerning the election, The reality is that in 2009, President Karzai had his hand in the fraud-plagued election. And the concern I think many of us have is what is being done to make certain that we don't have a repeat in this. We already hear some of his commentary about possibly postponing an election, all right? What steps are being taken to make certain that the international community has in place something that can stand up to his efforts to try to manipulate the election process? Should he try to do so again?
Well, I think both State and AID are working on this, so Larry may want to amplify. First of all, I would note that in 2009, although there was a great deal of fraud, there was also no doubt about who the winner was, since even if you disallowed for all the fraud, Karzai was still 20 points ahead.
Well, that may be true, but the fact that he was willing to go in and
No, I agree.
commit the fraud is what's concerning to me, because when this is over, Afghans have to have some level of confidence, and they know what he tried to do last time.
No, I mean, that was prefatory to saying that it's more serious this time because the election's likely to be closer.
Right.
And it's important that the margin of victory not be smaller than the margin of fraud. Now, I think we are reasonably satisfied that the election preparations to date are much better than they were in 2009 or 2004. They're being undertaken in accordance with legislation rather than a presidential decree.
Right.
The legislation has been fully followed with reasonable adherence to its provisions. The Electoral Commission seems to have a strong leadership and so far has made decisions which are broadly accepted by most of the candidates as fair. The international community, in the United States in particular, are continuing to follow this closely and render support in a number of sectors, and I think Larry can expand on that. President Karzai has not said anything to date which would indicate any desire to postpone the election. Everything he said privately and publicly to us and to everybody else we know of is consistent with his desire to conclude this election on time and to leave office on schedule. There's a lot of suspicion, as you say, based on earlier experiences. And in any new democracy, that kind of suspicion is in any case endemic. But for the moment, we haven't seen any evidence of such.
This is encouraging. I did want to ask Larry Sampler about specifically, if I could, the election monitors, because I think that's one area where we are playing a pretty important role. The security forces, the election monitors, particularly female officers, since that's necessary in this environment to sort of screen women voters as they come in. We want to make sure all women have the ability to vote in this situation, that all Afghans and young people have the ability to queue up and have their ballot cast. Give us a quick update on that front.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The U.S. is contributing about $100 million to this election. Of that, roughly $55 million is going into a UNDP basket fund to support the elections. That provides the technical assistance that will help the Afghan Independent Electoral Commission conduct the elections in a way that's as free and fair and independent of fraud as can be done. The other $45 million we're retaining and investing bilaterally in areas where we see particular need. Voting monitors and polling station monitors is one of those areas. Another is civil society engagement, particularly with respect to women's interest groups. And we're investing in technology that we really didn't have access to, or we didn't have the sophistication to have access to in the last election. And as an example, I spoke yesterday about SMS technology that women in Afghanistan are now using to collaborate and coordinate their approach to their candidates to make sure that they're getting their issues on the platforms of all the candidates. So there are both technological and technical assistance ways that we're investing our resources in support of the elections. Certainly areas, there continue to be areas that concern us. One of them is the access of women to polling places. I was in Afghanistan a month ago, and each time I visit, I go to the Independent Election Commission and get an update. They're aware of the problem, and they're working to fix it. Now, I can't promise promise you that their solution will be robust in every district of Afghanistan. But to be honest, having been engaged there now for 12 years, I'm just pleased to see that they have a methodological approach to how they're identifying these problems and pushing and addressing them. They are putting money where the problems are. They are training women security, and they're training women polling place workers. And I think we will see an improvement, a dramatic improvement over 2009 in that regard.
Thank you. My time's expired. I'm going to go to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Assistant Secretary Dumont, in a recent Foreign Affairs piece, former Ambassador to Afghanistan, retired General Carl Eikenberry, wrote that counterinsurgency strategy failed in Afghanistan. Would you agree with his assertion that COIN was not successful in Afghanistan, and if so, why didn't it work?
I would not agree with that. And the reason I say that is we look at the gains that have been made to date in Afghanistan since we've arrived there, and with the support of 48 coalition nations, as well as the Afghan security forces, the strides made have been monumental. And I think it's too early for anybody to claim that a counterinsurgency effort has failed. The ANSF has been consistent in taking the fight to the enemy through this fighting season. They've done remarkably well. They have adopted the training and tactics that have been provided to them and taught them. Their police are stepping up to the plate more and more each day, and quite frankly, the most recent fighting season that they've had this past summer has given them confidence and skill that they've not had in the past. They are certainly exceeding our expectations, and I believe that will continue for the future. But to say that it's a failure, I think, is wrong.
And as you know, many of our constituents want us, and they express this very clearly, want us to bring home every last U.S. soldier, everyone. So when the Department of Defense recommends the size of a residual force going forward, what factors do you consider, and what will the mission of those forces that might remain in Afghanistan after 2014 be? And finally, to the extent you wish to comment, how would you respond to so many Americans who just simply think that it's time to bring everyone home?
So I understand the position of the American people, and I've served in combat myself on 3 occasions, including a year in Afghanistan. So I understand the concerns. What I would say is that our top priority is to prevent the return of al-Qaeda and any affiliated terrorist groups that can launch attacks on the United States from the country of Afghanistan. That is our first and foremost priority, and I think the American people understand that. I can assure you the American military understands that. As far as what the mission will be after 2014, given a BSA and an invitation to remain in Afghanistan by the Afghan people, is a train, advise, and assist mission to assist the Afghan security forces in further developing and advancing their skills and their capabilities into the future so that they can assist with providing their own security and ensure regional stability. Like any emerging country, any emerging military force or police force, they will require training, assistance, and support generally as we provide with many other nations. But our mission after 2014 will be a train, advise, and assist mission along with coalition partners who will and have offered to remain there. And as Ambassador Dobbin said, BSA will be critical to that, and the Afghans are fully aware of that.
Thank you. And Ambassador Dobbins, Mr. Sampler, if there were to be a negotiated settlement with the Taliban, do you believe that the Taliban would accept the provisions of the Constitution, and if so, would that be sufficient?
We've laid down 3 conditions for a successful negotiation with the Taliban: that they accept the Afghan Constitution, that they lay down their arms, and they break ties with al-Qaeda. And we would require all 3 of those for any solution that we would support. I don't see early breakthroughs in the negotiations. In fact, I'm not sure that we'll even be negotiating in the next few months. We've made efforts in the past. We're consistent in support of a reconciliation process, but it takes 2 to tango. And the Taliban, while they've been willing to talk to us, have not been willing to talk to the Afghan government. And frankly, it's the Afghans who have to negotiate peace. So I don't predict early advances in this sphere. I would hope that there'd be at least some procedural steps, but I can't promise it. Over the longer term, we do believe that reconciliation is the only way the war is going to end, and the quicker you start, the faster you'll get there, even if it's going to be a multi-year process.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. We go to Eliana Ross-Layton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. As I had mentioned when we had met with President Karzai, as all delegations do when they go over there, and in our delegation we raised the concerns about his neighbor, the Iranian regime, the threat that that poses to our interests in the region, and Mr. Kennedy and Dr. Baer will probably agree that he dismissed the threat that Iran poses, no problem at all. But Pakistan, that is the real threat to stability for Afghanistan, he said. So it shouldn't come as a big surprise that this past weekend, Karzai and the leader of Iran, Rouhani, announced the agreement of a long-term strategic pact that ranges from political cooperation to economic and security partnerships, once again undermining and jeopardizing the U.S.-Afghanistan relationship. What is Karzai's calculus here? Is he trying to hedge his bets by cozying up to Iran and being outwardly defiant to the U.S.? What is his thinking, if you could give us some insight in that? And while in Afghanistan and during our hearings, I also expressed my concerns about the status of counter-narcotics operations in the post-drawdown Afghanistan, and we've been talking about that this morning. We were told that due to lack of personnel, these U.S.-led counter-narcotics operations will be severely limited in scope. The latest numbers indicate that this was a record year for poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, and this issue of counter-narcotics operation is not getting the attention it rightfully deserves, considering that terrorist activities are typically funded through narcotics. If we can't conduct the kind of operations needed to reduce the poppy production, and if we don't have enough manpower now to fight this issue, what are we going to do next year and post-2014 to stop the illicit drug trade that generates over $100 million a year for terrorist groups? And I've been concerned that we're allowing the post-2014 residual force size also to be decided politically, and that is purely numbers-driven rather than focused on the task and what is needed, what is the mission that still needs to be accomplished in Afghanistan. And Mr. Dumont, you testified that a significant accomplishment since taking the lead is the Afghans has been increasingly able to maintain the gains made by our U.S. and coalition forces. And although that may be true now, what about in the post-withdrawal Afghanistan when they won't have quite a robust international force in support, or possibly with no U.S. presence at all if the president goes with the zero option, when the extremists no longer see us as an impediment to their goals and come to against the Afghanistan forces in full force? Will they be able to sustain those gains? What will happen? And do you predict that the White House, in coordination with the State Department, when do you think that we will get that troop level number from the White House and the State Department? I'll leave it open to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on Iran, as the chairman pointed out, Iran has provided arms and money to the Taliban. It has, however, provided a great deal of more money to the Afghan government. It has quite substantial aid programs. Most of them are quite benign in Afghanistan. Iran has, in general, a very bad relationship with the Taliban. It almost went to war with them well before we did. But it is hedging its bet, and it is hedging it largely as part of the competition with the United States rather than because it has an inherent positive interest in the Taliban. Karzai has visited Iran once or twice a year since he became president 12 years ago. And so I don't attach a special importance to this particular visit. They haven't negotiated an agreement. They've simply announced an intention to negotiate an agreement. There is no agreement.
Thank you.
There's no draft on the topic.
Turn it over to the other two gentlemen. Thank you, sir.
Ma'am, I would say, first and foremost, we do continue working with Afghan counter-narcotics police. They've made significant strides in enhancing case management and prosecutions, including the ability to develop evidence, arrest, conduct trials, and imprison those convicted. They do demonstrate a determination to uphold rule of law, and they are increasingly resistant to the influences of corruption. Several reasons for this. Besides the training and assistance they get, they also know that the eyes of contributing nations and donor nations are on them, and they understand that it is important upon them and incumbent upon them to make changes. And they are making achievements in that regard. We work with them also on developing good practices for sharing intelligence with the police forces so that they can get at their narcotics trade and that they can make strides. But again, it's a work in progress, and it will require them to assume some responsibility and ownership themselves based on some of the good practices and training that they've received from us and other coalition nations. As far as the ANSF continuing to uphold the security gains that have been made in the future, the groundwork is there for the gains that they've made.
Thank you.
Both as an institution and as a force.
Thank you so much. Sorry, out of time. Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Joseph Kennedy from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for testifying today. Thank you for your service. I was fortunate enough, as former Chairman Ross Layton indicated, to visit Afghanistan several months ago and had an extraordinary visit to see the work of your work and the work of many of the folks you support. So thank you very, very much for all that you do for our country. Wanted to speak first, if I could, to Special Representative Dobbin and Mr. Ambassador. If you could focus just specifically a bit on one program that's come up in a number of meetings that I've had and that some constituents were concerned about contractors and translators. So those who have been performed an extraordinary service to our military and civilian corps both in Iraq and Afghanistan and are now subject to death threats and violence for their affiliated work with us. The visa programs, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, my understanding is that they've run into some fairly severe challenges. I believe in 2008, under the NDAA, Congress created 25,000 visas for Iraqis who worked for the government at least for a year. Another, I think, 8,750 were created under the Afghan Allies Protection Act of 2009, again, for our Afghan allies that worked for the United States in some capacity. Can you give me an outline, sir, just to the best that you can, one of how many Afghans are eligible for that program, how many have been processed to date, what that timeline is, and what that backlog might be, the causes to that backlog, and what we can do to try to help?
Thank you. I believe that we were slow in getting this process into gear, and for the first several years, the number of applicants who successfully completed the process was fairly low. Over the last year, however, this is significantly accelerated. In fact, I think the last year we had 10 times more successful completions than in the previous year. In fact, we're now approaching the legislative limit in the numbers available, and we're looking forward to working with Congress to extend our authority to bring in additional people.
And how many more would
I think about 1,600 have been approved over the last year, if I remember the figures correctly.
And how many more visas, sir, would you recommend, or would you be asking for help for Congress?
I'm not sure. I don't have the figures. But there is, in addition to the total number, I believe there's an annual number, and I believe that runs out in March or April, and we'll need to work with Congress to get that extended because there will be additional people in the pipeline who would qualify.
Okay. Thank you very, very much. And Mr. Dumont, I wanted to build a little bit off of the Chairman's comments, Ms. Ross Layton's comments about the poppy cultivation. When we were in Afghanistan, that was certainly something the point that was made over and over again. And I just wanted to see if you could outline, give any detail to enforcement strategy or a mechanism to try to get that trade under control.
We do have a interagency task force and an interagency coordination center that continue to provide intelligence support, training, and assistance to the counter-narcotics police. They enable the Afghans to target narcotics traffickers and connections with insurgent groups. They go after the movements, communications, and finances involved in groups involved in the drug trade. They are also working to provide support for investigations and for military operations that identify people who are involved in the drug trade, getting at their financing, getting at their cultivation, getting at their movements, getting at the delivery of those illicit drugs.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry to cut you off. Time's limited. And so, Mr. Sampler, if I could, there's obviously a piece to this which is an economic issue for the cultivation of the poppy for farmers that are choosing to cultivate poppy in terms of the economic income that they can generate from that. I would imagine that falls very much under USAID's auspices. Can you give a brief 30-second outline as a strategy there and how you see that forecast going?
Yes, certainly. I appreciate that you recognize that. The issue with counter-narcotics is not one purely of enforcement. We have to provide alternate livelihoods. USAID and the international donors writ large are working to create value chains for other crops that are either as profitable or even in some cases of saffron, for example, more profitable than poppy. The problem is it's a very, very harsh environment, and poppy is a very resilient crop. It doesn't, I mean, it does well in Afghanistan. Furthermore, the traffickers do all the heavy lifting for the growers. So until we can get the value chains for saffron, fruits, and nuts up to the level of what the narco traffickers have for poppy, this is going to be a difficult and a challenging environment for us.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, we want to recognize and thank you for you and Mr. Barra's trip there, accompanying Eliana Ross-Leighton, both in terms of the oversight of this committee, but also in visiting the troops in Afghanistan. We want to also recognize Joe Wilson for his recent trip there, but also for his son's service in the U.S. Army in Afghanistan. Mr. Wilson, it's your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your interest in the security of Afghanistan, American security, even prior to 9/11. And people need to understand, and I want to thank each of you for the difference you're making, that indeed the attacks on our country September 11, 2001 originated out of caves in Afghanistan. We should never forget that. And that's why I'm really grateful for our military service. I've had the opportunity in USAID. I've seen the progress that has occurred. I've been there 12 times. My National Guard unit, former unit, served there and led by Adjutant General Bob Livingston. It was the largest deployment of troops from South Carolina since World War II, 1,600. And they really developed a great affinity for their Afghan brothers. So we saw that. And then I appreciate the Chairman referencing my youngest son, First Lieutenant Hunter Wilson, returned last Thursday from his service this year in Afghanistan. So as I talk about military service, it's quite personal. We're very proud of the 122nd Engineer Battalion, South Carolina Army National Guard, for their service there. I was particularly glad to see Representative Kennedy raise the issue of the special immigrant visas. I've had two sons serve in Iraq. They've actually cooperated in bringing their interpreters back to the United States for opportunity, for security. I'm very grateful. I've had a nephew in the Air Force, Alan Heritage, served twice in Iraq. So I know firsthand, and indeed again with my son serving in Afghanistan, how the interpreters, the civilians working with the American and our allies, how important they are. And so I do want to work with you, and I specifically hope that we will have an extension agreement or proposal, Ambassador, as soon as possible so we can give hope to the people in that country and thank them. I'm also, though, concerned about Iranian weapons in Afghanistan. In August 2010, the Treasury Department sanctioned 2 Iranian Quds Force officers for supplying funds and material to Afghan terrorists. That was just one example of Iran playing an active role in fueling the conflict in Afghanistan. What is the role that Iran is playing supporting the Afghan terrorists? What groups does Iran support and why?
Well, as I said a little earlier, Iran supports both the government and the Taliban. Its dominant support is to the government and to largely benign aid programs, roads and other things, but it does support, has provided money and arms to the Taliban. The arms and money flows across the Pakistani border are much more important than across the Iranian border, but nevertheless, Iran is playing both sides of the house. It's doing that not out of a love for the Taliban. They hate the Taliban. It's doing it as part of the competition with the United States and as an effort to demonstrate to the United States that they could play tough too if we got into some kind of military conflict with them. So I think they're hedging their bet, and it's quite unhelpful. But it's not the totality of Iran's approach to Afghanistan, which, with this very important exception, has largely historically been quite coincident with our own. They were quite helpful in 2001, and as I've said, they've had a significant and largely benign aid program for Afghanistan.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, you give real meaning to diplomacy, and so trying to keep an even balance on these issues, I want to thank you for your service.
Thank you.
And additionally, I'm concerned about Iran's sanction violations, that in January, it was determined by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction that possibly there had been purchase of fuel for Afghan forces in violation of the sanctions. Has that been stopped, and what can be done to make sure that the sanctions stay in place, which have been so effective?
I'm not familiar with the case. I assume this is a DOD purchasing issue, but I'm afraid I can't give you a quick answer.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson, I don't have that information either. I will have to take that back and get you a response.
And that's very important, because we have seen the success of the sanctions bringing pressure on the Iranian regime, and I'm still hopeful that, in particular, that the sanctions have the potential of encouraging a green revolution. The young people of Iran deserve to have a better life than what they have now and what the prospects are. And so the sanctions have multiple purposes, but one is to truly assist a positive change in Iran. Thank you very much for your service.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Elliot Engel of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank all witnesses, very distinguished witnesses, for coming. Thank you for being here, and the three of you have what I consider to be some of the most complex and thankless jobs in the U.S. government, and all of us appreciate your service very, very much. I share the frustration of my colleagues about the games that President Karzai has been playing. He ought to sign the BSA and stop the nonsense. I just want to say that. Let me ask Ambassador Dobbins, and then perhaps Mr. Sampler can comment. Much of the resource planning for post-2014 is happening in the field, but I'd like to know what state and USAID here in Washington, how you're doing similar planning. What's the timeline in which the Afghanistan and Pakistan offices at State and USAID are going to return to the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs and Asia Bureau? And how are State and AID planning to address the new resource environment and the personnel changes that will occur with these transitions?
I wouldn't say at this point we have a firm plan. There's a general intention to look at the current bureaucratic arrangement in the State Department in the light of the transition at the end of 2014, when we'll move from a combat operation to a train, advise, and assist operation with a much lower number of troops. I think even then Afghanistan is likely to remain difficult enough, tricky enough, and important enough to the United States that you're going to want more than just a desk officer handling it. But I think there probably could at that point be a closer association with the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, and we probably would move to some such arrangement. But I think the actual transition is not very complex to make. It's simply changing some lines on on an organization chart. It's not as if people are going to have to be fired or recruited. So the fact that we haven't made a decision now a year and some months off doesn't mean we won't be able to make a timely decision.
Thank you.
Ranking Member, the only thing I would add is that I think at USAID, the bureaucratic changes will be driven by the effects we want to achieve in the agency. My two missions are the largest missions by an order of magnitude that the agency has anywhere in the world. So even if we were folded back into the Bureau, it would have to receive particular and unique attention. You asked what we do here in Washington to help the field team work on their resource allocation. And I think that the single greatest value that we add is engaging the communities of interest here, whether it be your staff or members themselves, the diaspora community, the think tank community. We get an awful lot of valuable input and a refining of our ideas by engaging in Washington and then supporting the field in that regard.
Thank you. Ambassador, let me ask you this. A key element of the economic transition in Afghanistan is obviously regional trade. And a key barrier to getting Afghan goods to market is the barrier that exists between Pakistan and India, so that most Afghan goods wanting to get to Indian markets go through Iran. I know that India provided Pakistan with most favored nation trading status back in 1996. Could you provide an update on where the Pakistani announcement of giving India trade status currently stands, and a more general vision of the role connectivity in the region can have on stabilizing Afghanistan?
Well, we've raised this with the government of Pakistan on several occasions, and indeed with the government of India, specifically the grant of most favored nations. It came up while Prime Minister Sharif was here in Washington during a visit a month ago. The Pakistanis have indicated their intention is to grant MFN to India. The question is one of timing. We, of course, have urged it to be done as quickly as possible. I think they didn't say so, but I think they may be waiting until a new Indian government takes office. They probably want to do this in the part of a context of other improvements in the relationship. The Pakistani government under the new Prime Minister has reached out and tried to improve that relationship. The Indians, for good historical reasons, are approaching this very cautiously. They take the Prime Minister's they believe that the Prime Minister is acting in good faith, but they're a little skeptical he can deliver on some of the things that they need if the relationship is going to progress. MFN for India would be a positive step, and indeed a general opening of the border to more commerce would also be very helpful for Afghanistan, as you've indicated, and for all those reasons, we continue to support it.
Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to just take a few minutes to point out some of the taxpayer dollars that have been sent to Afghanistan and spent almost wastefully. And I would like to put an article from Bloomberg News in the record about planes parked in the weeds in Kabul after $486 million were spent. These are G-222 aircraft, some of which are sitting in the weeds, not being used. Those are taxpayer dollars that were spent to purchase those. We also spent somewhere between $25 and $36 million on a 64,000 square foot unoccupied building in Camp Leatherneck, which May of 2010, the commanding general, General Mills, recommended cancellation of the construction, and that was overridden by his superiors. And then in May 2013, the building's still sitting not used. The Army Regulation 15-6 investigation said we ought to convert that building to a gymnasium and spend more money converting it to a movie theater. That was overridden. The building's still sitting unoccupied. Thank goodness we didn't spend any more money. $230 million in spare parts in an inventory warehouse. There was no good inventory or accountability for those spare parts. These are vehicle parts. And an additional $138 million in spare parts were ordered just in October of 2013. I want to commend the work of Congressman Jason Chaffetz of the Oversight Committee, who's been working with the Special Investigator of Afghan Reconstruction, the SIGAR. He's identified fuel usage and waste and theft in Afghanistan. He's talked about the expenses of the hospital in Kabul, where U.S. tax dollars have been wastefully spent. We could go into the Bank of Kabul fiasco and allocation of dollars there, but infrastructure projects that are all over Afghanistan and there's no oversight. These are in areas that are inaccessible to civilian employees. And I would like to point out, and I know the panelists are aware of this, but this is the Afghan Oversight Access in 2009. The shaded areas are areas that civilian contractors or U.S. employees have access to in 2009 to do oversight on U.S. taxpayer dollars being spent. If I flip over to the projected 2014 oversight areas, you'll notice a stark contrast. I know it's difficult to see, but these gentlemen are aware of this. They're just little dots there. These are areas that U.S. inspectors do not have access to for oversight. These are U.S. taxpayer dollars. How much more money are we going to continue to spend in Afghanistan without proper oversight? And that's really what it's about. So I don't have any questions along those. I could go through a lot of other examples, but I think the American taxpayers that are watching understand that their tax dollars are being spent without a lot of oversight on part of their government. So I'd like to shift gears to Ambassador Dobbins. I think that's who I would address this to, but I'm interested in the special immigrant visa program and the delays that are going on there, because Congress has recognized the unique dangers faced by Iraqi and Afghan civilians who worked on behalf of the U.S. government by creating programs for these individuals to become lawful permanent residents here in the U.S. I've had an example of a gentleman I met in the Kandahar, the Kandahar region of Afghanistan about 2 years ago. He was embedded with the military there, had acted as a translator, had taken up weapons to help defend the colleagues of the unit he was working with, and he was definitely threatened by the Taliban. His uncle was killed, other family members were threatened, and went through a 2-year process where officers from the unit that he was embedded with, other folks that knew this gentleman vouched for his service to America there in Afghanistan, but yet it took over 2 years. He was actually issued a visa by the State Department, and then it was revoked right before he left, and had to go through months of trying to understand why it was revoked, and then it was reissued. I think it was reissued only after Congress got involved questioning why. But so I ask, why have there been so many delays in the Afghan SIVs, Ambassador? And I'm assuming you're the right one to ask that question of.
No, I think that's right, sir. I think we were slow in the early years to implement this program. Over the last year, however, it's accelerated significantly. I think there were 10 times more visas issued this year than there were a year ago. And in fact, we're approaching the limit of the program. We'll run out of numbers shortly, and we'll want to work with Congress for an extension of the program, since there will be additional people who will qualify if we have additional numbers. On specific cases, I mean, we have to determine that they did work for the U.S. military. We have to determine that they are under threat. That depends in part on where they live. And there are other security-related concerns. I can't explain any particular case. I know the case that you're referring to, and within, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, maybe even less, of the visa denial, it was then reissued, as you indicated.
And I appreciate the assistance on that, and got the gentleman here. Mr. Chairman, I did want to put this in the record. And
without objection.
Thank you.
We go to Mr. Ami Bera of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. As has been mentioned previously, I had the opportunity over Memorial Day to visit Afghanistan with Congresswoman Ross Layton, as well as my colleague, Mr. Kennedy. When we were there, we met some of the most remarkable young men and women in our troops, and I really do want to praise our troops for meeting every mission and for the wonderful job that they've done. We also had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Karzai, and in that meeting, this was back in May, he unequivocally expressed a desire to get a BSA done fairly quickly, and at the same time unequivocally said he has no desire to stand for election again, and wanted to see the elections that are coming up in 2014 take place without any interference. Given that the Loya Jirga has supported the BSA, and now Mr. Karzai is backtracking, I would make the observation that he happens to be who we have to negotiate with, but he's not someone that I would call an honest broker and an easy one to negotiate with. I also had the opportunity to visit India and chat with our allies in India who have made significant investments in Afghanistan. Over $2 billion in investments in infrastructure and projects like the Salma Dam, and others also have had the opportunity to meet with business groups like CII and FICCI and major Indian multinationals like the Tata Group and the Mahindra Group that are interested in making investments and helping fill the void that will occur regardless of whether there's a BSA or not as we start to draw down our own investments. Their major concern, though, is the security situation there. In addition, as I've met with the Indian government and Indian dignitaries, there's also a very real concern that hardened, trained jihadi fighters will start shifting over to the Indian-Pakistan border, where we're already seeing a flare-up and increasing incidents. Given that, and maybe this is a question for Ambassador Dobbins, what can we do, working with India to, one, continue to maintain an economic structure in Afghanistan? Again, I do worry about, as we draw down, significant economic resources are going to come with that, as well as working with India on the Indian-Pakistan border as some of these fighters shift over. I'm not sure Pakistan has control over these fighters either. So, Ambassador Dobbins, your perspective.
We do work closely with India on Afghan issues. I met with the Indian Foreign Secretary yesterday on this, for instance. President Karzai is visiting India later this week, and for a state visit, in fact. India has a significant aid program and significant investments to the extent, probably the greatest contribution India could make and Pakistan can make in Afghanistan is improving their bilateral relationship. Improved relationships between India and Pakistan will have two effects on Afghanistan. One effect is it will greatly increase the access of Afghan trade to India via Pakistan. But secondly, and equally important, it will reduce the competition between the two countries for influence in Afghanistan in a way that's often proved highly destabilizing. So we've been encouraging both both Pakistan and India to overcome their differences in Kashmir, their differences over Afghanistan. I think there is some hope with the new Pakistani government. Of course, the Indians have elections shortly, but it's an area that we're continuing to press. I don't think that there's any near-term danger of foreign fighters shifting from Afghanistan to the border with India, among other things, because unfortunately the war in Afghanistan isn't over. But the Indian concerns are legitimate, and it's something that we do need to be careful about.
Do you sense in your conversations with the Pakistani government that I sense that the Indian government certainly does want to see improved relationships with Pakistan as a mechanism of stabilizing South Asia as well. Do you sense that same desire from the Pakistani side?
I do, and I think the Indians do as regards the new prime minister and his civilian leadership. Now, in Pakistan, traditionally, the security sphere has been left largely to the military, and they've been largely free of civilian oversight or control. The last time Nawaz Sharif tried to exercise that kind of control, he was overthrown by General Musharraf. So he has to be careful about how quickly he moves to assert civilian control of the military and a stronger civilian role in designing and implementing Pakistan's national security policy. I think the Indians, he has expressed himself very clearly that Pakistan can't be secure unless Afghanistan is at peace and relations with India are improved. And he's tried to move in both directions. I think the Indian government takes him at face value and believes he's sincere. They're a little skeptical that he will prevail in exercising enough influence over the Pakistani military, and we'll just have to wait and see. But we give him a fair chance of being able to do so, among other things because the Pakistani military now realize that their biggest threat is internal, and they realize that they need the political leadership to take responsibility for the kinds of sometimes harsh measures that will be needed to deal with that internal threat.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We now go to Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, who served as an Air Force pilot in Afghanistan and also served with Special Operations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Appreciate your service and taking the time with us. As the chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, I just came back from Afghanistan. Actually, we did Afghanistan